All right, it's my pleasure to welcome Britton Stephens for our seminar today. I guess most of you know who Britt is, but I'll give you a short introduction anyway. So he's a ladder track scientist here at EOL, and in fact, this is his ARC seminar. So hopefully one step up. And I'm sure your committee is sitting here somewhere. So let's wish you good luck. Britt's research is focused on developing and deploying new instruments for tower, ship, and airborne observations of atmospheric O2 and CO2, and on synthesizing data sets and models to elucidate global carbon cycle processes. His carbon cycle interests span terrestrial ecology, oceanography, atmospheric chemistry and dynamics, and climate change mitigation. He got his bachelor in 1993 at Harvard, the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department there, and his PhD in 1999 at Scripps. From 1999 to 2002, he was a postdoc at NOAA, GMD. Was it still GMD already back then?
Yeah, I don't know what it was called. Carbon Cycle Gases Group.
Anyway.
I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, that's the first time I met.
CMDL, that's what it was.
Oh, CMDL at the time? Okay, I was at CMDL at the time, so. And since 2002, he's been here at EOL, quite busy. Britt published over 50 journal articles and book chapters. And his talk today is Oceanography Among the Clouds and Terrestrial Ecology, 1,000 miles from land, the power of global scale airborne observations. Please, Britt.
Okay, thank you, Holger, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here. With apologies for the cryptic title, what I'm actually going to be talking about today are some fundamental aspects of the global carbon cycle, which until quite recently have remained unquantified, either because our measurements were too sparse or too locally influenced or limited in some other way. And I'm going to be arguing that by taking a big step back, in this case by getting in an airplane and flying to some of the most remote places on the planet, we can gain a better perspective and a clear picture of what's actually going on. So I'll be talking about a series of aircraft campaigns called HIPPO, ORCAS, and ATOM, with contributions from many different instrument team members as well as collaborating modelers. The first property of the carbon cycle that I will discuss is the northern extratropical terrestrial growing season net flux of CO2, which is essentially the total amount of CO2 that the land biosphere takes out of the atmosphere every year between spring and fall. And then I'll move from there to talk about the annual mean fluxes of CO2 and their latitudinal distribution, which has important implications for carbon climate feedbacks. There's an ocean analog to the growing season net flux, which is called the seasonal net outgassing of oxygen, and it's closely related to the hemispheric total productivity by the marine biota. And then finally, on a more regional scale, I'll talk about exchange of CO2 and oxygen with the Southern Ocean. And I'll wrap up by just sharing a few ideas about how we might expand and extend some of this research into the future. So why should we care about the exchange of carbon dioxide and oxygen with the land biosphere and the world's oceans? The plot in the top left shows the canonical Keeling curve with an extra line added, showing the amount of CO2 we've added to the atmosphere through fossil fuel burning. So CO2 is only going up in the atmosphere about half as fast as we're dumping it in, and that's because plants in the ocean are taking up the other half. This is a great benefit to society. Climate change would be about twice as worse if this were not happening. But unfortunately, we don't understand the mechanisms responsible for this uptake well enough to predict their behavior into the future. In addition to the climate benefit that these systems provide, of course, forests on land and plankton in the ocean have other benefits, such as supporting biodiversity and the entire marine food web. So there are lots of reasons why we might want to monitor their behavior going forwards. The cartoon on the lower right is from the fifth assessment report, and it just illustrates our best understanding as of a few years ago of the global carbon cycle. And what I'd like to highlight by zooming in here is that the net fluxes that we're interested in, which are the annual fluxes between the land and the atmosphere and the ocean and the atmosphere, both about 2.5 petagrams of carbon, 2.5 billion tons of carbon per year, are actually very small residuals of much larger gross fluxes. So in the case of the land, we have about 120 petagrams of carbon per year going in and out of as a result of photosynthesis and respiration, and similarly large numbers in the ocean. So that makes it really hard to pin these numbers down through observations, and also makes it really hard to model them accurately. A paper in 2013 in Nature Climate Change by Bodman and others converted the uncertainty in CO2 fluxes into the impact in terms of uncertainty in temperature projections, and found that about a third of our uncertainty in projecting temperature into the future is a result of uncertainty in land and ocean carbon fluxes, the balance being the physical climate system. And in a recent paper, Nikki Lewandowski and Gordon Bonin compared a bunch of CMET5 model projections for carbon uptake over the next century, the land in the bottom right and the ocean in the bottom left. And this really highlights how big the uncertainties are. You can see the cumulative uptake for the land is spreading among the models by hundreds of petagrams of carbon by the time you get out a century. That translates to 1 to 2 petagrams per year now, which is almost as big as the fluxes themselves. For the ocean, you see that the real spread is due to which scenario you choose. So they're tracking the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and just responding directly to the burden. But we should always keep in mind that the models may all have common biases, and there are uncertainties that aren't captured here. Now, another thing that Nikki and Gordon pointed out was that you can't use the observational record to winnow down these models. If you've just picked the ones that match the observed carbon uptake, they can do that for different reasons and then diverge into the future. So we really need to improve our understanding of the processes responsible for the uptake if we want to improve our predictions. So there are many ways to estimate carbon fluxes or to measure them. A really popular one is to take all of the measurements of CO2 in the atmosphere, which is represented by the map in the lower left here, and then combine them with an atmospheric transport model to infer what the fluxes must have been to produce the observed distribution. When you do this, it's analogous to running the atmospheric transport model backwards, and so these are referred to as atmospheric CO2 inversions. You can also go out and just start measuring trees and counting trees, and you can also measure the amount of CO2 dissolved in the ocean. This device in the upper right is an equilibrator that's on a ship. It's pumping seawater in continuously, equilibrating that in a chamber, and then measuring CO2 in the headspace to infer how much CO2 is in the water. And then finally, of course, we have prognostic Earth system models, which try to encapsulate our best understanding of all of the processes and generate internally consistent climate predictions as well as representations of the carbon cycle. So the problem with these measurements are several. In terms of counting trees or measuring PCO2 in the ocean, you're taking a measurement which is highly locally influenced. And in the case of measuring CO2 and then trying to infer a flux, you're dependent on the accuracy of the atmospheric transport model. And in particular, most of these measurements are in the atmospheric boundary layer at the surface of the Earth, and so that you're really sensitive to the amount of vertical mixing in the models, which they don't do a particularly good job of. So I highlighted this in a paper published in 2007, where along with colleagues, we collected output from 12 different atmospheric inversions and a set of light aircraft vertical profiles for CO2. And what this figure in the top left is showing is on the y-axis the results from the inverse models for both the tropical land in blue and the northern land in red as a function of the vertical gradient in the atmosphere. And what we found was that most of these models were trapping too much CO2 near the surface in the Northern Hemisphere, and as a result, they required really big uptake in the north to match the observations, and conversely, to match global budgets, they needed really big outgassing in the tropics. What the measurements suggested was that, in contrast, there actually was much less uptake in the north and almost neutral exchange in the tropics. And knowing what we do about deforestation, this implied strong uptake in intact tropical forests. Now, these measurements were still too sparse, really, for what we wanted to do. And this paper and the work I was doing leading up to it happened to coincide with the arrival of the G5 at RAF. So in talking with colleagues about this problem, we came up with a plan, and this study served as the primary motivation for a proposal to take the G5 around the world in 5 different times of year, flying up and down the whole time, measuring vertical gradients of CO2 to really try and pin down the carbon cycle. And this project was called the HIAPER Pole-to-Pole Observations Study, or HIPPO. It was led by Steve Wofsy at Harvard, along with myself, Ralph Keeling at Scripps, and Jim Elkins at NOAA. We measured over 90 species on, as I mentioned, 5 campaigns over 3 years. The map in the lower left is from the HIPPO 3 campaign and shows a typical route where we went up to almost the North Pole and down almost to the coast of Antarctica. And the flight profile on the right shows what we were doing, which was basically flying up and down that whole time. Oops, going forward. So I had 2 instruments on this aircraft and also the other campaigns that I'll show, which I developed here at NCAR. One is the NCAR Airborne Oxygen Instrument, which is an in situ analyzer measuring oxygen concentration, and then a whole air sampler called the NCAR Scripps Medusa flash sampler. On the HIPPO campaign, there were AO2 measures CO2 as well, just to do a dilution correction, but there were 2 other CO2 instruments, and there were also 2 other whole air samplers. So I'll be showing data from a selection of these. This is what we found on HIPPO 3. This is from the Harvard QCLS instrument, a map of CO2 versus altitude and latitude. And I've detrended the measurements by subtracting an estimate of the annual mean, which comes from the Mauna Loa record. So what you're seeing is deviations about 0. And we found this huge plume of CO2 in the Northern Hemisphere. We were quite surprised at how high into the troposphere that permeated in the middle of winter. We had these preconceived notions, and indeed many of the models did too, that the atmospheres should be trapping these signals closer to the surface in the winter. So you can see we took this great slice out of the atmosphere, and there's actually a name for this now, which is called atmospheric tomography. Tomography meaning to measure a slice of something. It's the same word that's in CAT scan. And we can combine all 9 HIPPO slices together, and this is what you get. Again, detrended, and I've put them in seasonal order. So what you see is the buildup of CO2 in the Northern Hemisphere as winter progresses, and then a really rapid drawdown in spring and summer, with the peak drawdown in late August. Now, as I mentioned, we sort of had this idea we were going to go out and measure the vertical gradients of CO2, and that was going to be one of the main products, but we quickly realized that we were capturing the seasonal exchange of the entire northern extratropical biome in a way that really hadn't ever been done before. But that's not exactly true, because it turns out that during the International Geophysical Year, Dave Keeling had a program collecting flasks from weather reconnaissance flights over the North Pacific and the Arctic. So the black lines on this plot show where the flights went, and they were flying along 2 different pressure levels, 500 and 700 millibars. Heather Graven started a postdoc at Scripps right as the HIPPO measurements were wrapping up, and she compared the seasonal cycle that we measured in HIPPO to that that Dave Keeling measured in the late 50s and early 60s, and found something quite dramatic, which is that the seasonal cycle in CO2 in the troposphere had increased by over 50%, almost 60% during that 50-year period. The plot on the left shows the seasonal amplitude of CO2 versus latitude, with the IGY measurements in black and the HIPPO measurements in pink. This had been observed previously at Barrow, Alaska, which is shown by the black squares here, but was not previously known how representative those measurements were. And indeed, it covers most of the latitude range from 45 to the north to the pole. Another interesting thing that Heather found, which is shown on the right plot, is that Earth system models are not able to capture this increase. Since this paper was published, there's been just a huge raft of studies proposing different causes for this and why models might not be getting it right. Several early papers pointed to the Green Revolution and the dramatic increase in agricultural production in the developing world over this time. Also, we know spring is happening earlier, so photosynthesis is turning on sooner, and fall is lasting later, summer is lasting later into the fall, so respiration is occurring later. So there have been some ideas that those could contribute. In my view, it's probably a combination of all of these things, but as a lot of interest has been poured into trying to match the percent increase in the CO2 amplitude, I actually got more and more interested in just trying to figure out what the actual total exchange was in terms of one number that we could then hold up against a model. So what I've done is gone back to the HIPPO data and just drawn a box around the northern extratropics with a cutoff at 20 north and from 300 millibars to the surface, and just counted up the number of moles in that box. Once you do that, you get a single number, and you can do essentially a large one-box atmospheric conversion. So I've used atmospheric transport models to estimate how much transport is happening across the edges of that box, and also to relate these measurements in the Pacific to the entire zonal mean. Those end up being fairly small corrections, and what you get if you do it for all of the HIPPO slices is shown here. Now I'm presenting a seasonal cycle in 18 months, repeating the first 6 months just to allow you to see the shape of the cycle more clearly. And what's plotted is petagrams of carbon. And it's the time integrated, now converting CO2 into a time integrated flux north of 20 north. And you can see you get this what looks like a very pretty cycle, no real outliers. But of course, this is just from one particular set of flights over a certain number of years. The bullets on the right are just listing the adjustments that were made to the raw data. The whiskers here are corresponding to error estimates associated with those adjustments. They don't actually represent interannual variability. So we worried about that, and then we also just worried about the fact that we were flying right down the Pacific, and things could be different in the Atlantic. So while we were thinking about all these things, along came the perfect opportunity to address them, which was a campaign called ATOM. ATOM stands for the Atmospheric Tomography Mission. And it's a direct descendant of HIPPO. It's also led by Steve Wassey from Harvard, but this time it's on the DC-8 and it has a different focus, which is atmospheric chemistry and specifically the reactivity of methane and ozone in the free troposphere. The flight profile in the top middle should look familiar from HIPPO, but then on the lower right you'll see the big difference with ATOM is the plane's not only going down the Pacific, it's also coming back up the Atlantic. So ATOM was funded for 4 campaigns. We've flown 3 of them already, and we have another one coming up this May. And I'm going to next show some more CO2 cross sections, but this time from ATOM 1 on the top row, and then ATOM 2 on the bottom row. And they look pretty similar to what we were seeing from HIPPO, again, detrended by subtracting an estimate of the annual mean. And you notice things that, I didn't point out on the HIPPO slices, but synoptic systems, here's a case where a system came through and sucked some low CO2 air down from the north and at the same time stirred some high CO2 air up from the south. Those sorts of things look different between HIPPO and ATOM, but once you start averaging over really large scales, from 20 north to the pole, for example, that all washes out. And so if I put the ATOM results on top of the previous plot, you can see they line up quite closely. This point here happens to be the northbound ATOM 1 flight up the Atlantic, which happened at exactly the same time of year as the HIPPO 5 southbound flight, and they lie almost perfectly on top of each other. So good agreement between ATOM and HIPPO suggests that interannual variability is at least not limiting in this analysis. We also see that there aren't big differences between the Atlantic and the Pacific Basin, so we had sort of this presumption that the atmosphere was mixing rapidly zonally and that you could fly down either basin and get a similar result. So that's encouraging to see. And what we end up with is a fairly precise measurement of the time-integrated CO2 flux. The number I get is 6.2 petagrams of carbon, so if you have a Earth system, if you have a land model, you don't even need an atmospheric model. You can hold that up next to it and see how you do. And we've still got 2 more campaigns to come. ATOM 3, which we already flew, but I'm not showing the data from yet, and then ATOM 4, which will happen in the spring, and they're going to fill in the remaining gaps really nicely. But we can already start comparing the models and thinking about what it all means. This is that same observational data and fit compared to the CMIP-5, a collection of the CMIP-5 models. And these are terrestrial ecosystem models that are part of Earth system models that are predicting the flux of CO2. And the first thing that catches your eye is they're really all over the place. And that's, again, because they're trying to predict this tiny residual between photosynthesis and respiration, and it's just a really hard thing to do. I'll point out with the mouse the CESM1 model is this dark green line that's in the clump of sort of low amplitude points. I have not had time to put CLM 4.5 or CLM 5.0 on here, but we know that those models have much larger seasonal amplitudes than CLM 4 did, which is the model that was included in CESM1. So expect those models to agree better with the observations. We can also hold these observations up against atmospheric inversions. Now, this is what I'm showing on the right here, comparing to a study that was part of the recap effort and published by Palan back in 2013. And it's a collection of atmospheric inverse models. They're trying to match the observations as best they can. So you would really expect them to do a good job on the on independent observations. However, they're, as I mentioned, primarily trying to match surface observations. So what you see is that those models are collectively underestimating the seasonal cycle in time-integrated CO2. And one possible reason for that is, again, these models circa year 2000 may have been still trapping too much CO2 near the surface. And if you trap signals close to the surface, you don't need as strong of a flux to reproduce observed gradients. So they need less outgassing in the winter and less ingassing in the summer in order to match the observations. So I really wanted to hold these up against the HIPPO data in the same way that I'd done in the previous study. Unfortunately, the modelers did not submit concentrations. This study was just comparing fluxes, so we weren't able to do that. So what I've done in collaboration with Ben Gobert from ACOM, who's here, is to go back and redo the whole study ourselves, collecting a suite of state-of-the-art atmospheric inverse results, both fluxes and concentrations, and comparing them to models. So what's shown here is the approach we've taken to do that. We've binned the HIPPO data by both pressure, altitude, and latitude. And for each bin, we've calculated a harmonic fit, where we have 2 harmonics and an annual mean offset. And what's shown here on the left is the amplitude that results from those fits, and on the right, the annual mean distribution. So as we saw from the individual profiles, much larger seasonality in the north, and an annual mean gradient consistent with fossil fuel emissions in the north. So to compare these to the models, what we can do is simply draw boxes over the upper troposphere and the lower troposphere and calculate averages, and then subtract them. So that's what we're going to do. To reorient you, this is just that same figure from the previous study with tropical land fluxes in the north and northern land fluxes, tropical land fluxes in blue, northern land fluxes in red, the results from the models versus vertical gradient. So now on the exact same y and x and y axes are the results from what Ben has done, and he's showing the tropical fluxes as stars and the northern fluxes as squares. And so what you see is that the models have converged. They no longer have this huge, spread of 4 to 5 petagrams in terms of the latitudinal distribution of carbon fluxes, and they also agree fairly well with the observations. The pink band and purple line here represent what you get from the analysis of the HIPPO data that I just showed. So these models again predict near neutral fluxes in the tropics, which implies strong uptake by intact forests. And there are actually 2 models that I haven't highlighted, is the gray one and the pink one, that span the entire time period to 1992. So we've looked at that, and they agree fairly well with the intercept of these lines and the gray observational band. These results suggest that seasonal vertical mixing is no longer the dominant source of model spread. And the one other thing that I wanted to point out was that if you think the reason the terrestrial biosphere is taking up carbon fluxes is because of, say, CO2 fertilization in the tropics, you might expect that to continue into the future. If you think it's being taken up at northern latitudes because of regrowing forests that were cut down in the last century, that should be tapering off. So I mentioned this has an implication for carbon and climate feedbacks. The suggestion is that there's a significant fertilization effect in the tropics, which we hope would continue into the future. The last point I wanted to make here is that the vertical mixing is not the dominant source of error, but instead other things are. And Ben's done an analysis of a lot of other factors in the models and found that the assumptions made about fossil fuel emissions are a big component of that, but that also the ocean and land partitioning is still quite uncertain among these models. So on that note, I'd like to shift and start and talk about the ocean This figure is from a study by Peter Landschutzer in 2014, and it presents the various estimates of global uptake of carbon dioxide by the oceans. Most of these lines are prognostic Earth system models with ocean biogeochemistry models in them. The black line and the two green lines represent observationally based estimates where they've taken PCO2 measurements from the types of measurements made in those equilibrators I showed a photo of before, and then treated them through different data assimilation techniques. And what you can see is that there's a general suggestion of an increasing trend in uptake that's consistent with what we expect because the atmospheric burden is increasing. There's some interesting decadal variability in there that you're not quite sure if you should trust because of the disagreements among the different estimates. And then there's just a huge spread in the total annual or long-term mean uptake, with trying to estimate a flux of around 2 petagrams with about 2 petagrams of spread. So it turns out if you want to figure out what's going on with the ocean, air-sea fluxes of CO2 by measuring CO2 in the atmosphere, it's quite challenging. And that's there are a couple reasons for that. One is that air-sea fluxes of CO2 are buffered by carbonate chemistry in the ocean. So when you have productivity, for example, by marine biota, you don't get a direct correspondence between the flux and the productivity. And then the other is, particularly at high latitudes, the dominant biological and thermal drivers are in opposition. So you can imagine in the summer when you have a lot of productivity happening, that's trying to suck CO2 out of the air, but at the same time you're warming the waters, which is trying to decreasing the solubility and trying to drive CO2 out. So the net result is that the seasonal changes in air-sea CO2 flux are quite small. But neither of those things are the case for oxygen. So I'm going to highlight this with a graph of oxygen and CO2 fluxes over the Southern Ocean. And this is on from two different estimates based on measurements in the surface water. So the red line is from the Takahashi et al. 2009 PCO2 climatology. And the green line is from a publication by Garcia and Keeling in 2001 using analogously dissolved measurements of oxygen concentration. And they're both on the exact same y-axis, which is moles per month, and what you see is that the oxygen fluxes are just much bigger than the CO2 fluxes. They're both driven by the same things, seasonal changes in heating and cooling of the surface and productivity. But if you want to figure out what's going on with CO2, it actually in many ways is easier to do that by measuring oxygen and not CO2. And that's why we put that oxygen instrument on the G5 for HIPPO and for ATOM as well. And so what I'm showing here now are the oxygen measurements from the NCAR AO2 instrument from a selection of the ATOM and HIPPO slices just to highlight the seasonal variability. And they might look very similar to the CO2 plots, but if you follow closely, they're actually exactly opposite. So the top row is from Northern Hemisphere winter, and we see a drawdown of oxygen in the north. And then in Northern Hemisphere summer, we see a big plume of oxygen. And that's the result of both photosynthesis on land and in the ocean. And then in the Southern Hemisphere, we actually see a larger seasonality than we did for CO2, with high oxygen during Southern Hemisphere summer and low oxygen during Southern Hemisphere winter. As I mentioned, part of this signal is due to photosynthesis and respiration on land. If we want to say something about the ocean, we need to correct that out, and there's a trick for doing that. The trick for doing that is to add oxygen and CO2 together and derive a tracer that we call atmospheric potential oxygen, sometimes referred to in seasonal contexts as oceanic oxygen. And so what that does is there's a multiplier on CO2, which is set to try and match the ratio in photosynthesis and respiration on land. And you come up with a tracer that's conservative with respect to land processes, but has a small sink in from fossil fuel burning and is primarily reflective of ocean exchange of oxygen and CO2. As I just showed, the seasonal changes in CO2 flux are small, so over the seasonal cycle, APO really reflects the air-sea exchange of oxygen. So I've done the same analysis on the HIPPO oxygen data, as I just showed that Ben and I have been doing on the CO2 data, where we've binned it by pressure level and also latitude, and the results are shown on the right. And what you see are high seasonal amplitudes at low altitudes and mid to high altitudes, and that's a direct reflection of the strong seasonal variability in solar heating and productivity. So what I'm going to do for the next analysis is just calculate column integrals at each of these latitude bins by taking all of the data from 300 millibars to the surface and averaging it up. And what you get is a plot like this for the seasonal amplitude of APO, of the column integral APO. And it gets bigger as you move away from the equator, as you expect. But one thing that that jumped out at me when I first saw this was that if you average up the seasonality between 20 degrees and 70 degrees in each hemisphere, you get almost the same number. And just common sense sort of tells you there's way more ocean in the southern hemisphere, and you should expect more oxygen outgassing in the south than in the north. So maybe this was a fluke, but I'm not showing the ATOM data here, but we've looked at it, and it still supports either matched seasonality or even more seasonality in the north than in the south. So this is a real head scratcher. I don't have a good answer or hypothesis yet, but I will point out where the disagreements lie with existing estimates. So the concept of seasonal net outgassing was first presented in a paper in 1992 by Keeling and Schertz. At least one of those names should be familiar to you because Steve Schertz is sitting in the audience. And that study looked at oxygen in the atmosphere. Subsequent studies have looked at dissolved oxygen measurements. And what I'm showing here is a table from the Garcia and Keeling study, the same study that was on the earlier plot. And I've highlighted the estimates from the two different hemispheres. And indeed, from the dissolved oxygen measurements, they were inferring something like 50 to 80% more outgassing of oxygen in the southern hemisphere than in the north. We can also run these fluxes through an atmospheric transport model, which I've done in collaboration with Sarah Mikaloff-Fletcher at NIWA and Prabir Patra at Jamstack. And that's shown here for the green lines, which are the same Garcia and Keeling fluxes run through two different atmospheric transport models. And again, plotting the seasonal amplitude of APO versus latitude. The similarity between the two green lines indicates that atmospheric transport can't really be used to explain these differences. And you also notice that the climatologies are underestimating seasonality in the north and overestimating seasonality in the south. I'm also showing three different ocean models on here. They're somewhat dated, but they give you a sense for the spread and also what happens when you put our current understanding into models. And they also think that there should be a lot more seasonality in the south than in the north. The CESM model does a remarkable job of matching the seasonality in the northern hemisphere, but is the highest one in the south. So there are a lot of things that could be going on in the models with the oxygen exchange. We know that these Earth system models tend to have not enough clouds in the south, so they may be getting too much solar heating or too much biological productivity. It's an ongoing area of study to try and reconcile these observations and model estimates. But in the meantime, Matt Long from CGD, who's here, and I were staring at figures like this, showing models and observations for oxygen in the Southern Ocean, and also similar plots for CO2, which show even more scatter. And we decided that we wanted to try and go measure this a little bit more directly. So that led to an effort with Matt and myself and a few other colleagues to submit a proposal to take the G5 down to Punta Arenas and fly around the Southern Ocean for 6 weeks in summer. That proposal was successful, and we went down there in January and February of 2016. This study is called ORCAS, the O2-N2 ratio and CO2 Airborne Southern Ocean study. The map on the bottom here shows where we flew, and underlying that is a satellite chlorophyll product. You can tell we really sampled the domain extensively. Typical flight involved transiting south to somewhere around the marginal ice zone and doing some porpoising in and out of the boundary layer, and then returning, doing large-scale transects like we were doing in HIPPO, and then subsequently have done an ATOM. These figures show the campaign mean curtain plots for oxygen and CO2. In the top right is just the flight profile, showing again how densely we sampled the altitude-latitude domain. On the left is oxygen, and you see this strong plume of oxygen at low altitudes and high latitudes. This is reflecting the strong productivity going on in the ocean, producing oxygen, as well as the surface heating during the summer, reducing the solubility and driving oxygen out. Conversely, for CO2, we saw a strong drawdown of CO2 at low altitudes and high latitudes. And that indicates that the biological productivity that's going on is dominating over the thermal heating. So all the productivity in the surface is drawing more CO2 out of the water than the warming of that water can compensate for. And we're seeing a net uptake in. I haven't shown it, but about half the CMIP5 models think CO2 should be coming out of the Southern Ocean at this time of year. So this alone was a new observation that allow us to discriminate amongst disparate model estimates. You also see lines for gray lines here that are potential temperature, and those just by eye indicate that the atmosphere is sort of trapping these signals. The atmosphere and the ocean both tend to mix along surfaces of constant density. So in this figure, I'm showing a comparison of the observed campaign mean CO2 gradient to several other model estimates. Matt was able to implement a new configuration of CESM for the study, which was the fully coupled model, including the ocean biogeochemistry, but with the atmosphere nudged by GEOS5 reanalysis meteorology. So the atmosphere was tracking the fronts in the real world, while the ocean biogeochemistry was sort of doing its own thing, but feeling that somewhat. It was very useful in a flight planning sense to decide where to go, and it's proving really useful in terms of doing the analyses after the fact. So that model, which we didn't really expect to do that well, did a remarkable job of matching the campaign mean observations. It's shown in the light blue here, and it's almost perfect for CO2. But Matt has taken the ocean CO2 fluxes out of that model and swapped in several observationally based estimates, and that's what's shown in the orange and the red. So the dark red is the Takahashi 2009 flux climatology, and the orange is the Lanchester product, which was shown as a black line with gray shading a few slides earlier. And what you see is that the drawdown in CO2 we measured during the campaign from about 5 kilometers to the surface was about twice what we expected it to be. We had arguments before we went down there about whether we'd even see CO2 gradients at all. So this was also a surprise. And we're still trying to wrap our heads around the implications of this because that, people really thought we knew a little bit more than that about what the fluxes should be. Another thing we can do is plot oxygen versus CO2 for the campaign, and I've done that here. This is again that bin data from the curtain plots, oxygen on the y-axis and CO2 on the x-axis. And we found a really tight correlation between oxygen and CO2, and this was also unexpected, at least for me. There are many different processes affecting CO2 and oxygen, and there's no real reason to expect the fluxes themselves to be tightly correlated at the air-sea interface. However, I think what this really is indicating is that the atmosphere itself is providing this large-scale integrating property, and as we saw with those potential temperature lines trapping the signals, it's taking the entire fluxes for the Southern Ocean and sort of spreading them across this potential temperature gradient, and they're very well anti-correlated. And that relationship should tell us something about the processes that are affecting the CO2 fluxes. But the ratio we got, minus 2.75 moles of oxygen per mole of CO2, is also not what we expected. If I go back to this plot from the dissolved gas climatologies, what you see is that during January and February, that they would predict about 10 times more oxygen outgassing as CO2 ingassing. And you'd really need about 3 times more. If you believe the oxygen product, you'd need about 3 times more CO2 uptake to match our observations. Now, of course, the oxygen product may be an error. Also, I showed a few slides ago how it was overestimating the seasonality. And if that's the case, then it's possible that the revision you'd need in the CO2 product would be slightly less. Again, this was 2016, which was a El Nino year, and there are a lot of reasons to worry about, the interannual representativeness of this. I have a shipboard program that's been running since 2012, making measurements in the same domain, and I've also looked at station measurements, and those are also showing consistent things. But Catherine McCain, who's part of the ORCAS team from NOAA, has also plotted ORCAS, HIPPO, and ATOM data all together. So what's shown here is the CO2 vertical gradient on the top left and the oxygen vertical gradient on the top right, with the ORCAS data in blue, the HIPPO data in orange, and the ATOM data in crosses. And what you see is during these brief snapshots we took during HIPPO 1 and ATOM 2, we were seeing CO2 gradients over the Southern Ocean about the same magnitude as we saw in ORCAS. And likewise, the oxygen gradients fell within the same range. So there's no suggestion, at least from this, that 2016 was particularly anomalous. And then she's also made a plot of a zoom in of the first 110 days of the year, and what you see there for the ratio of oxygen to CO2. And what you see is the ratio was evolving during HIPPOs, becoming closer to 0 as the oxygen fluxes became less strong. But the HIPPO and the ORCAS data, which are indicated by daily mean values in the black dots, fall right in line, and they're nowhere near that -10 value that we thought we might see. So we're really learning a lot from these types of measurements, going out into the middle of the ocean and porpoising up and down in the airplane. And we'd like to figure out ways to continue doing this and to do it a little bit more regularly to address the interannual concerns and to be able to detect changes over time. So in the few minutes I have remaining, I would like to share a couple ideas on how we might go about doing that. So the first idea is to take advantage of the U.S. Antarctic program's LC-130 resupply flights that currently operate regularly between Christchurch and McMurdo, and then also between McMurdo and the pole. Matt Long and I have been encouraged by NSF to submit a proposal to do this. Indeed, I've been encouraged for many years to do this. They've had an interest in seeing science done on these flights. So we're now actually moving to do that. The idea is to have a roll-on, roll-off rack because the one catch is you don't know which of several aircraft is actually going to fly on a given day. So it's not like the luxury we have here where we can take a month to certify a payload for one particular aircraft. And then initially just to measure CO2, methane, CO, and water vapor with a single Picaro instrument. Those C-130s are down there for 4 months from November through February. So we'd be able to capture the mean gradient over similar, the mean vertical gradient over similar latitude as we did in ORCAS, and we'd also be able to capture the evolution over the season. And we have some indication that they'd be willing to dip halfway across. The second idea is a little bit more a little bit more out there, but it's something I'm excited about, and I'm calling it the Tomographic Atmospheric Observatory. This is a acronym, work in progress, so happy to take suggestions. If we don't come up with anything better, we might have to paint the G5, Jeff. So the idea is to do repeat, sort of mini HIPPOs on a repeat schedule, and to do them in roughly 2 weeks. Now that's pretty aggressive. People at RAF would probably be coughing as I say that. But in order to do that, the payload would have to be very light. So something like 2 racks, just measuring oxygen, CO2, and methane. And then to be able to upload and then fly this circuit to the North Pole and down to Kona and back in about 2 weeks. But by keeping it light and being able to do it quickly, we could do it multiple times per year. So I'm currently talking to the pilots and exploring with colleagues opportunities for proposing something like this. There's several different sort of agency calls or dear colleague letters that seem particularly relevant. And if we were going to go for this, we'd want to do it for a long period of time. And the real payoff would be, instead of quantifying growing season net flux and seasonal net outgassing over sort of a 3-year or 10-year period for one cycle, we'd be getting that cycle every single year. And then we'd also be able to track Arctic methane emissions. So I will wrap up just by restating the primary points. As HIPPO has shown, the growing season net flux of CO2 has increased by over 50% in 50 years. And if you want to know the actual number, over the past 10 years, it looks like 6.2 petagrams. So the inverse estimates have converged in terms of the latitudinal distribution of carbon fluxes. They agree well with HIPPO and still imply strong sinks in intact tropical forests. There's currently a puzzle with regards to seasonal net outgassing of oxygen. The seasonal amplitude of APO appears similar in both hemispheres, in contrast with models and climatologies. And both the vertical CO2 gradient and the O2-CO2 ratios that we measured over the Southern Ocean during ORCAS suggest much greater and biologically dominated CO2 uptake than previous studies. And the USAP flights of opportunity and long-term dedicated tomographic observations may offer effective opportunities and cost-effective. Of course, flying a G5 around 4 times a year is quite expensive, but I should point out that we're currently trying to get these same quantities from satellite measurements. And NASA has spent over $750 million on the OCO project. Some of the results I showed were from that, so I shouldn't complain, but flying aircrafts around is actually relatively a fairly cheap way to get at these fundamental properties of the carbon cycle. And indeed, almost everything that we've looked at with these data has shown that our preconceived notions were completely wrong. And so it's an exciting time to be studying the carbon cycle and to be doing it with aircraft. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Britt. Thanks for a very nice talk. And are there any questions? Come on, somebody.
Nobody wants to be first. Scott.
I'd just like to hear a little bit more about what is available from space, and are there concerns in terms of just accuracy and what's coming down for the next 10 years or so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, Ben and I are participating as part of the OCO science team. So the OCO2 satellite has been up for a number of years after, of course, OCO1 failed to make orbit. And it's collecting this amazing data set in terms of mapping CO2 over the whole entire planet, in a very short period of time. But you're trying to make a measurement of CO2, which is 400 ppm in the atmosphere, down to about 0.4 ppm or better. So it's a 0.1% measurement you're trying to make from space. That's incredibly challenging. And as it turns out, there are large biases owing to sun angle, albedo effects, land-ocean differences. And those have taken a really hard time to sort out. So if you just take the satellite data and run through an atmospheric conversion, you get results that are widely divergent. My feeling is there's a lot of really unique information in the satellite data, and we just haven't quite figured out how to pull it out yet because we're using this sort of outdated concept of just cranking atmospheric conversions. And so a lot of the exciting work that's happening with OCO is learning how to be smart about the biases and then getting the information out that we can. There are a number of satellites that are coming. I mean, there's a Japanese satellite that's up now, GOSAT, and another one, Tanso, that are up, and I think there are a couple more being launched now. OCO3 was sort of the spare instrument for OCO2 that was supposed to go on the space station, and that's, of course, been called out by name to be defunded by the White House the last several rounds. So there's still work ongoing, but no one's sure if it'll be funded. I think long-term measuring CO2 from space is going to be an important thing, but you just can't get away from having in situ measurements. And I didn't highlight this, but all of these aircraft campaigns we're doing is particularly in the G5 and the DC-8, where you can get really high into the lower stratosphere, are incredibly valuable for providing validation data for the satellite products.
Very nice talk. Perhaps I missed this, but is it possible to summarize the implications of your measurements for climate projections that have currently been made? Is that even conceivable?
Yeah, so, well, I'd have to sort of run all the way back to one of my early slides, but what you'd like to be able to do is to, so these different colors are for the different scenarios. Let's, say, God forbid we end up doing the RCP 8.5 type emissions. You'd really like to know whether or not the land biosphere is going to take up 200 petagrams over the next 100 years or release 300 petagrams over the next 100 years. It has a huge impact in terms of what the temperature is going to be, but also if you say, I want it to be 2 degrees, it has a huge impact on how much gasoline you should be burning right now. So the one thing I'll say is that the work we did with the inverse models and the aircraft data in the 2007 study, which was followed up by a paper I wrote with Dave Schimmel a couple years ago, was all suggesting that the fertilization effect was a large part of the reason why there's a net land sink. So these models will all disagree in terms of how much they think photosynthesis responds to there being more CO2 around. So that would suggest that the models that think that there's a big effect are more realistic, which would suggest that the models that are projected to take up CO2 might be more realistic. The models that are releasing CO2 probably have less of a fertilization effect, and if they're matching the observational record now, they might be matching it because of, say, land use effects. So that's one example.
Yeah. Does that suggest that if more CO2 is being taken up, that the climate change's projections would be less?
Well, certainly this model right here, well, sorry, I'll take that back. RCP 8.5 is, the way they set up the RCPs makes those things a little bit coupled. But a model that has a bigger fertilization effect will have less CO2 in the future and less warming. Now, they're currently the land is taking up about a quarter of our emissions and the ocean's taking up about a quarter of our emissions. They're not going to make climate change go away. If we'll be lucky if they keep up at about that rate. A lot of these models think that as it gets warmer, you start to stress ecosystems, that they start to lose CO2. And so I think the optimistic scenario is that they keep taking up about 2.5 petagrams. And of course, we need to stop burning 10 petagrams if we ever want CO2 to not go up.
Sorry. Any other question?
I was intrigued by the CO2 oxygen correlation that you showed. Could you say a little bit more about, there's some kind of spatial and temporal averaging that goes into that plot.
Right.
So what is that? And then does this not have anything to do with this quasi-conserved quantity under land processes that I think was APO or something?
Yeah. So one thing I'll point out is that on land you get almost a 1-to-1 ratio between oxygen and CO2 exchange for photosynthesis and respiration. In the ocean, there's this concept of the Redfield ratio, which is something like 1.4 moles of oxygen produced per mole of carbon. But the air-sea fluxes that respond are nowhere near that ratio because of the buffering chemistry that sort of delays and mutes the air-sea CO2 flux response, and then the different solubilities and different air-sea gas exchange rates. What you actually see at the air-sea interface often has very little to do with, say, the Redfield ratio of what the actual plankton were doing. So that's going on all over the ocean. Matt made forecast maps of oxygen flux, and what you see are big blooms that are producing a lot of oxygen. And then the CO2 field is much more spread out and muted. The oxygen equilibrates within about a week across the air-sea interface, and CO2 takes months to equilibrate. So you look at these spatial maps, and they don't seem to have any correspondence to one another. But what I think is happening is the atmosphere, the vertical mixing time throughout the troposphere is on the order of a month or so. So that vertical gradient that we see here is really being established over a month or so. And over that month, the air has gone around Antarctica several times, and you're really seeing the net impact of several months of fluxes here. So on that time scale, you sort of have one average CO2 flux number and one average oxygen flux number. And then it's just, if this were somehow perfectly mixed, you might not see this nice gradient of gradually changing oxygen and CO2 numbers, but because of the way the atmosphere sort of spreads the signals out, that's why you get this thing. This is colored by altitude. I forgot to mention that, but from near the surface all the way up to the tropopause, following along a single linear relationship. Now, what APO? So one thing that I didn't present is that there are small contributions to this CO2 gradient from fossil fuel burning and terrestrial processes a long way away, and they come in sort of at high altitudes in the troposphere, and we see enhanced CO2 from fossil fuel burning in the Northern Hemisphere and depleted CO2 from photosynthetic uptake 6 months prior. What APO does is it allows you to sort of correct that out. In terms of a vertical gradient over the Southern Ocean, you don't really need APO because the land influences are so small. But if you were studying the seasonal cycle over the Northern Hemisphere and wanting to say something about ocean fluxes in the North Atlantic or North Pacific, they'd be about equal, and it would be a large correction. I hope that answers your question. Here we are.
Nice talk, Britt. This morning we saw a talk by Dave Lawrence where he showed the CLM model improving from 4.0 to 4.5 to 5 and results getting better and better and better. Have you looked at your results in the same light? Have your results compared to his modeling gotten better in time?
Yeah, so I caught the end of his talk online, so I'll go back and watch it, but I'm guessing he probably showed this plot of the accumulated or cumulative carbon uptake where CLM 4 had not enough uptake and CLM 4.5 had too much uptake, and CLM 5 is sort of the Goldilocks right in the middle. Yeah, which is great to see, but I think the thing that you can take away from models jumping that much from version to version is that this is an emergent property of the model that's dependent on a lot of other things. You can't, so there are a lot of things that affect that number. And so my view is we have to look for, I think somebody asked a question about how well do we know the cumulative carbon uptake. We actually know it really well in that case, but it still may not be the most useful metric because you can get it right for so many different reasons. So I think you have to look for other observations that more directly relate to processes. So a lot of the stuff I showed today is sort of taking the view that the seasonal cycle is this natural laboratory for investigating processes influencing the carbon cycle. So these huge swings in sunlight and temperature, well, not so much sunlight, but temperature and precipitation are somewhat analogous to what we might expect going on in the future. So I would say look at the seasonal cycle. And if you look at 4.5, if you look at CLM4, it had about half the seasonal amplitude. And I said I hadn't plotted it yet, but 4.5 had about the right amplitude.
Okay, let's give Britt one more round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you.
And if there's any more questions, I'm sure you'll hang around and
Yep.
talk to him. Thanks, Britt.